Christopher Hitchens is an Anglo-American author, journalist, commentator, critic, contrarian, and provocateur. He's considered one of the most influential writers of politics, literature, and popular culture wherever the English language is spoken or read. He is also ranked among its leading essayists and conversationalists and considered one of the world's leading public intellectuals. But don't let the word intellectual scare you off. You may be infuriated with some of his opinions, but it's not likely you'll be bored. He is an engaging, boozy, bare-knuckled writer who is now waging his biggest fight against stage 4 cancer. And as he likes to point out, there is no stage 5. But he's still writing for an audience that spans generations and national boundaries.
The story will continue in a moment.
That broad appeal was never more apparent than one night early last summer, when Hitchens was interviewed by his friend Salman Rushdie before a highbrow New York audience. And then later,
Christopher Hitchens
appeared on Comedy Central's Daily Show with Jon Stewart, both to promote his new memoir, Hitch 22.
How are you, sir?
It's a bit early to say.
Stop it.
The audience may have assumed that Hitchens was making a joke about his well-known penchant for staying out late and drinking. In fact, unbeknownst to anyone, he had checked himself out of a hospital earlier that day after having been told that he most likely was suffering from metastasized esophageal cancer.
I'm a member of a cancer elite. I rather look down on people with lesser cancers.
Have people survived it?
Oh, yeah, it can be survived. But the statistics are 5%, in other words, which are not the odds I would have picked.
We began our conversations with him a few months after he had been diagnosed. He had already canceled his book tour and begun an intensive protocol of chemotherapy, which had robbed him of much of his energy and all but a few strands of his hair. Now, most of his research and rumination were focused on his own mortality. What is your life like right now? I mean, in terms of what you're able to do and how you feel physically?
I was very afraid it would stop me writing. I was really petrified with fear about that because I thought that would, among other things, diminish my will to live. Because being a writer is what I am rather than what I do.
It would be impossible here to adequately summarize his output, since it includes 25 books and countless articles, reviews, and commentaries pounded out over 4 decades through a haze of cigarette smoke and filtered through kettles of Johnny Walker Black. Suffice it to say, he writes with confidence, conviction, certainty, and an air of self-satisfaction, using his wits and words as weapons to eviscerate egos and slaughter sacred cows. He's labeled Henry Kissinger a war criminal, Bill Clinton a rapist and a con man, and the British royal family a blight upon the reputation of England. I mean, you do go over the top occasionally.
I'm in no position to deny it, but I'm wondering if you had I'd do better if you said where you thought that was.
Well, you called Mother Teresa a fanatical...
a fundamentalist, a fanatic, and a fraud.
A fanatical Albanian dwarf.
Lying, thieving Albanian dwarf.
Lying, thieving Albanian dwarf.
That was, I admit, an exercise in seeing how far I could go.
But why did you want to do it?
It was about celebrity culture. Now, Mother Teresa started with a reputation of being a saint, and therefore everything she did had to be reported as saintly. Thus, the fact that she took money from the Duvalier family dictatorship in Haiti, who must have oppressed the poor more than any other dynasty in history, somehow wasn't a fact, because it couldn't be true, because a saint wouldn't do that.
What about Princess Diana?
Well, with Princess Diana...
I'm trying to remember what you said about Princess Diana.
Well,
compared her to a landmine.
Well, there's a horrible joke about a landmine, yes.
Yes.
She was in Angola on her landmine campaign. And there was a hushed, reverent BBC commentator who said, the thing about minefields is that they're very easy to lay, but they're very difficult and dangerous and even expensive to get rid of. Now, the perfect description of Prince Charles's first wife.
You wrote it, and it was printed.
Oh, yeah.
Christopher Hitchens was born 61 years ago into what he calls the gray middle-class austerity of post-war England. His father was a naval officer, and his mother the first real splash of color in an otherwise drab existence. She told him the only unforgivable sin was to be boring, and he has rarely committed it. She aspired for him to go to Oxford and become a proper English gentleman, and one of those wishes came true. At Oxford, Hitchens says he kept 2 sets of books. By day, he was an international socialist pamphleteer, and his nights were spent sipping whiskey and fine wine with the Oxford elite.
Any exercise of hedonism on my part was actually a rebellion against conservatism. Might not have been for everybody, but it was for me.
You were somewhat famous or infamous at Oxford, I take it.
Notorious would do, yes. Yeah, I was.
People knew who you were.
I've always been able to give a speech in public, and 68 was a good year if you could just get up on a truck or an upturned barrel and make a speech through a megaphone or without, or in the more parliamentary style, which I had been trained for by debating society, speak at the Oxford Union against members of the government. I mean, cabinet ministers would come on the train. It was only an hour from London, and you could meet them when you were 18 and debate with them on level terms.
Within a few years of graduation, he was one of the most famous journalists in Britain, covering wars abroad and creating mischief at home. Margaret Thatcher once spanked him on the rump and called him a naughty boy. But he soon found England small and confining.
And Dr. Samuel Johnson used to say, famously said, if a man is tired of London, he's tired of life. And I was tired of London by the time I was 30. I decided England was too small, I wanted to leave. I'd never get bored here.
Here is Washington, D.C., where Hitchens has lived for the last 20 years with his wife, Carol Blue, and the youngest of his 3 children. They've not gotten around to actually hanging pictures, but Hitchens seems to know the exact location of every book in his vast library, from Byron and Spinoza to Gray's Anatomy. He's read all of them cover to cover and can still quote lengthy passages.
And here's a collection of holy books, if ever I want to look for loopholes.
For years, he hosted a famous party for Vanity Fair here, rubbing shoulders with Supreme Court justices, senators, Hollywood royalty, and network news anchors, providing ammunition to rivals who call him a shameless name-dropper and social climber. The apartment is currently being expanded with the proceeds of his recent bestseller, God is Not Great. You've elevated your career by picking on bigger and bigger targets. It's kind of gone from being Hitchens against Kissinger, Hitchens against Clinton, Hitchens against Mother Teresa, Hitchens against God.
Well, in a way, of course it has to end with the belief in the divine, yes, because that is the origin of all dictatorship.
To some, Hitchens may be most familiar as the country's best-known atheist.
Don't keep the faith.
He has taken on organized religion in his book, in dozens of articles, and on the debate platform all over the country.
I don't think it's going to take 10 minutes to disprove the existence of God.
Religion, he contends, is the source of all tyranny, and that much of the trouble in the world can be traced to fanaticism, whether it's practiced by Islamic terrorists or settlers on the West Bank.
It is the wish to be a slave. It is the desire that there be an unalterable, unchallengeable, tyrannical authority who can convict you of thought crime while you are asleep. A celestial North Korea.
Wherever he appears, his readers fill auditoriums and wait in long lines for him to sign their books, even in the Bible Belt.
If I could change just one thing, it would be to dissociate the idea of faith from virtue.
This event was in Birmingham, Alabama, and one of his fans even smuggled in a bottle of Hitchens' favorite beverage, which he refers to as Mr. Walker's Amber Restorative.
My cup over thirst.
Hitchens has a legion of close friends that includes writers Martin Amis, Ian McEwan, and the critic James Fenton, all of whom attest to his superior intellect, social skills, and a legendary constitution that allows him to consume staggering amounts of alcohol. Author Christopher Buckley recalled a restaurant lunch that began at 1 p.m. and ended near midnight.
At the end of this 10.5-hour epic lunch, I would have happily checked into the nearest hospital to have oxygen, blood, and extensive liver work. I think he went home and wrote an essay on George Orwell.
Christopher never does anything by halves, so his attack is always a 250% attack.
Salman Rushdie occasionally hid out in Hitchens' apartment after the Ayatollah Khomeini authorized his murder for blasphemy. And Graydon Carter, the editor of Vanity Fair, is a longtime Hitchens employer, having assigned him to write about everything from what it's like to get a complete spa makeover to what it's like to be kidnapped and waterboarded. Hitchens quickly concluded that the latter was definitely torture, although the bikini wax was more painful. What was it like to edit him?
He was so erudite that it was putting in sort of declarative sentences for the rest of us so we'd all be roughly on the same page. But the prose is absolutely perfect. You don't need to line edit, Christopher. You just need to help him explain it to
people
readers.
who are less smart than he,
which
includes
all of us, yes. Just about everybody.
He would assume that everybody knew what he knew. And, and nobody did.
Not everyone is so generous. As you might expect, Hitchens has made a lot of enemies over the years, including many former comrades on the left who have heaped scorn upon him for supporting the invasion of Iraq. Hitchens responded by having himself sworn in as an American citizen by the Chief of Homeland Security. When we spoke to him last month, he seemed to be basking in the venom of his detractors.
I mean, Alexander Coburn, a former friend of yours, called you self-serving, fat-ass, chain-smoking, drunken, opportunistic, cynical, contrarian.
Well, I don't see what's wrong with that. Though, he should see my ass now.
Hitchens says he nearly died in January when the chemotherapy began to destroy his innards. He called it a bad dress rehearsal. He's now in an experimental program with a cutting-edge drug that has shown some promise attacking the specific type of cancer cells that are eating away at his body. He's hoping that it will produce a long remission, but as usual, he's keeping 2 sets of books.
I mean, I make preparations both to live and to die every day, but with the emphasis on not dying and on acting as if I was going to carry on living.
How far do you think ahead?
I hate it when people ask what the expiry date of my credit card is. I noticed it the other day. Someone said, "What's the expiration date?" I said, "Who wants to know?"
Hitchens has been deeply touched by the letters and emails that he's received, many offering prayers for his recovery. What's needed, he says, is a medical outcome that would have to be described, given the poverty of the English language, as a miracle. But he is placing his faith in science and medicine, not in the existence of a God.
Is there anything that could change your mind in your weakened state?
Well, I ought never to say there's nothing would change my mind. So, shall I just say that no evidence has or argument has yet been presented that would change my mind? But I like surprises.